Sounds like this must be the state of freedom out here. I want to thank everybody who's put so much effort into, because you had at least 3 months to get ready for this function, didn't you? And all of a sudden, a lot of people show up. That means the issue of liberty is alive and well and growing. That's what I believe, and I think that's what I'm witnessing right here today. It's great to be among so many friends, and Elizabeth, it's great to see you again, and I appreciate very much all your work over the years. And I can't help but think about somebody that was a very, very good friend of Elizabeth and mine and many of you people here, because I can't think of Idaho without thinking about liberty, without thinking about Ralph Smead. There's no doubt. He was always convinced ideas did have consequences, and I think that's absolutely true. Also with me today is my wife, Carol, 55 years old. And we have one of our 18 grandchildren. Linda's with us today. Our trip out here to the Northwest has been fantastic. It's much more than I had anticipated, and the turnouts have been great, and the enthusiasm is great. But the big job we have is translating that into a few victories, and that's what we're looking forward to. There's been a lot of work and effort put into the campaign and all the efforts, and there's a lot of good news out there that's not quite yet on the mainstream media. You know, they don't always report what's going on, and the delegate count is coming along quite well, and we have an opportunity to add quite a few more delegates right here in this state. But our country has we've gotten ourselves into a big mess. And the one thing different from 5 years ago or even 10 years ago is most Americans realize it now. For a long time, we've kept our head in the sand, and people were in denial. They didn't want to worry about tomorrow. If you can live for today and you can borrow more money, prices of houses are going up, we can keep borrowing and live high on the hog forever and ever. But all of a sudden, the big bubble has burst. We've had small bubbles bursting all along. The big bubble started in 1971 when the last link of gold to our dollar was taken away, and that ushered in this huge bubble. And that is the reason we can't ignore monetary policy. We will address monetary policy, and we will address the subject of the Federal Reserve System and the return to a gold standard. But about 100 years ago, that was when the Fed was started, 1913. Matter of fact, we have 1 year to go for the 100th anniversary. Wouldn't it be a neat time that we repeal the Federal Reserve Act? Certainly, the system that we have, whether we get around to repealing the law, one thing is this system can't continue. And that's what American people have discovered now. We cannot keep borrowing and spending and printing money. More regulations. We do too much of it, it causes a crisis. So what do they do in Washington? They spend even more money, they print more money, they regulate even more, and they turn it over to the Fed and they print more money, and they wonder why it doesn't solve our problems. Well, they have their head in the sand, and they are in denial. They're not willing to say that economic interventionism, Keynesianism, paper money doesn't work. The founders knew that. That's why they gave us a document that said there shouldn't be a central bank, that only gold and silver could be legal tender, and that you could not print money. So they knew it, and we ought to take their advice and change our way of living. But in that fateful year of 1913, we had a few other things going on. We had not only the Federal Reserve coming into existence, we had that other little document changed, the 16th Amendment, which needs to be repealed, obviously. The income tax tax in a free society is not appropriate. If you want to live in a true republic and a government dedicated to protection of liberty, you don't need to declare ownership of everybody's income and then permit each and every one of us a certain percentage that we can keep. That principle of ownership of all that we earn has to be challenged, because it comes from a very basic understanding. Our lives and our liberties come from our Creator, not from our government. And if that is true, the natural consequence of that is we ought to have the right to keep the fruits of our labor. In the Woodrow Wilson era, our foreign policy was changed, and he took it, and it was always, he based it on a form of idealism, false idealism. His idealism was that it is the moral obligation of the American people to make the whole world safe for democracy. Well, it hasn't been very safe since 1914, and certainly the goal shouldn't be this dedication to pure democracy. Matter of fact, pure democracy undermines the republic. That's what the founders worried about. They wanted a republic, not a pure democracy. And yet, over this last 100 years, there was an evolution. We went from a republic to a democracy. Now, rights are relative. They're relative to the demands of the majority. The majority becomes the dictatorship, and certain groups get together. They get together and they gang up on the productive system. The non-productive, the special interests, gang up on the individuals who basically are the middle class, who's willing to work and take care of themselves, and all with the pretense that we're going to help the very, very poor who are falling through the cracks. But guess who gets all the help? The very wealthy, who are tied into the banking system, tied into the Federal Reserve, tied into the military-industrial complex, tied into the lobbying system, and in all the power that we have in Washington. So we have changed our course of history by accepting a form of government that is not compatible with our Constitution. Now, it is true that we could have changed our Constitution systematically if this is what we wanted, but we didn't want it. We ignored the Constitution, so the solution is very simple. Send only people to Washington who believe in and will obey the Constitution. Government, and our country would be a lot wealthier. Instead of spending $4 trillion worth of debt overseas in the last 10 years, that $4 trillion would have been spent here at home. And there were a lot of But today we have very few who are determined to follow the letter of the law, and yet everybody in Washington takes that oath. They take the oath to obey the Constitution. But just think, if we restricted adherence to the Constitution, would the federal government be involved in education? We don't need the Department of Education. It's unconstitutional. That just happens to be one of the 5 departments that I would like to get rid of rather rapidly and as fast as we can. But if we don't do this, our economic problems are going to get much worse. Our civil liberties are going to continue to deteriorate. So, other than getting rid of the 5 departments and going back to the 06 budget line, I do want to immediately, in the first year, cut $1 trillion out of the budget. Comparisons, I think you know what the current administration will do. I think they've just given us a budget. It didn't go down. But look at the other Republican candidates. Are they offering any cuts No. But they'll say they are. They're saying, well, even some of the budget proposals that came out of the stalemate in the Congress and then the stalemate and the confusion with the super committee, then the automatic cuts, they're talking about $1 trillion of cuts. They weren't cuts. They're cuts of the proposed increases. They're planning in this line item budgeting. We're supposed to be able to spend $10 trillion of new money over the next 10 years. So they're going to cut $1 trillion out of these proposed increases, and they call that cuts. Now, if you cut $1 trillion, if you cut $1 trillion over 10 years, that's $100 billion a year. Our national debt is going up $100 billion every month. I mean, that's how far removed they are from reality. So, one thing I sense is the American people are waking up. They realize how bad things are. They're trying to speak out and trying to get the attention of Washington. But I'll tell you what, people I know there, except for very few, they don't have any idea the seriousness of this problem that we have. They think that we are somehow going to be protected because we still have the reserve currency of the world and they're still taking our dollars. But if it were true that we could keep spending money, running up $1 trillion a year debt, or $1.5 trillion, and we print the money that we need, if that were true, guess what? None of us would ever have to work again. All we do is print money and let the foreigners work for us, and we just spend our money. Everybody knows that's not true. So reality will set in, and there is no reason in the world to think that we are not immune from the kind of conditions that are existing in Greece today. And that's what we have to live up to and believe, that we have to get down to the basics and say we have to cut, we have to balance our budget, we have to have sound money, we have to restore the Constitution. But since 100 years ago, our freedoms didn't disappear overnight. Matter of fact, the disintegration of the currency didn't occur immediately. Between 1913 and 1971, there was steady depreciation and deterioration of the value of our currency. But in 1971, when the last link to gold was severed, we have since that time lost 85% of the 1971 dollar. Since 1913, since the Fed was created to protect the value of our money, we've lost 98% of the value of a 1913 dollar. And they consider that success. Well, they've gotten away with that for a long time. They were always giving credit. The Fed was given the credit for creating the booms, and everybody likes the boom periods. But if they understand economics and Austrian free market economics, you have to realize for every boom there's a bust. And we have been having those constantly. But up until now, the Fed always got credit for getting us out of the bust. They would just print more money, and it seemed to work. Governments would spend more money, print more money, and the confidence was there enough. We just accumulated more and more debt. Now, we're up against a wall. We can't just keep accumulating more debt. Our credit rating has gone down once, it's going to go down again, and we're on the road to a real economic catastrophe as long as we continue to do this. So it is up to the current generation. You know, I used to talk a lot, and people still do talk about, we have to quit doing this and running up this debt or we'll pass it on to the next generation. Guess what? We are the next generation, and we have to deal with the debt and the crisis that we have today. Do is nibble away and tinker with the budget and not change a philosophy. This is why the revolution that's going on now is a idealistic, it's a theoretical revolution and a change on what government should do. The founders had a very clear understanding of what government should do. And the government was not to be very complicated. The Constitution is not that complicated. Nobody in Congress can read those bills and understand them, but most Americans can read the Constitution and understand the Constitution. The founders ask the questions, well, when they were living under the oppression of the king, and they said it's too much government, too much abuse of our civil liberties, too many military officers marching into our houses, and they didn't like the role of the king, and they did not like it. Now, the founders were very well educated. They were educated in the classics, they were educated in biblical history, and they knew that the type of government was that they had was not the kind they wanted. So they asked the question, what should the role of government be? And their answer simply was, a true republic, the role of government is to defend liberty. No more complicated. It is not to run the economy, it's not to run your personal life, and it's certainly not to police the world. That is not part of it. But somewhere along the way, systematically, these concepts were undermined, and the concept of liberty was divided up into pieces. Instead of seeing liberty as an individual issue where you have the right to your life and you have a right to your money, you have the right to run your social and religious life outside of what the government says, and also your economic life. But over the last 50 years, there's been one group that, sort of defends economic liberty, and another group sort of defends civil liberties. But it's all one and the same. We have come to think that because we got off on a tangent in our early history, because certain groups were punished. They had less liberties than others. There's still a little bit of that. Is that working? How about that? Okay. How are we doing now? Are we back again? Before you knew it, we would have had a conspiracy worked up real fast. Now let me see, where was I? I was talking about liberty, I'm sure of that. And that economic liberty and social liberty is one and the same, because we get our rights as individuals, and our rights come from our Creator. In our early history, we did have abuse of groups because we saw people as part of a group, and that is wrong. There's still some of that going on. I think there's abuse in our judicial system, because when you see the enforcement of drug laws and a few other things, certain groups are punished much more so than other groups. So we are far from a perfect delivering of justice in this country. But we've drifted away from a real abuse in a collective sense. But just because we know that we're not supposed to punish people because they belong to a group, but we're not supposed to give privileges to groups because they belong to a group. And the answer to that is seeing every one of us as an individual. We shouldn't have hyphenated rights. We shouldn't have special privileges because we belong to a group. It can't be by gender or by race or anything else. But nobody can be punished, and nobody gets benefits. Everybody gets equal protection under the law, and that's what would happen in a true republic. Unfortunately, the attack in Washington, D.C. is an attack on civil liberties, but the tragedy there is it's an attack on all Americans, what's going on right now. It is an attack in a narrow sense in one group, but what is happening, I think, is very, very serious. And we just had, it's about a year ago, I think it was in February last year, the administration sent a representative to the Senate, and he testified that they changed their policy unilaterally, the executive branch changed the policy, and the president declared that he had the authority to assassinate American citizens. And he proved his point. He's done it on 3 occasions, including one 16-year-old boy that was out barbecuing to make his point. But this whole idea that because somebody seems to be a bad person is no justification of the worse the person is, the more necessary it is to make sure that they get justice, to make sure that we always have justice in the court system. You know, if the Nazi war criminals had a trial, and Timothy McVeigh had a trial, and Adolf Eichmann had a trial after many years in Israel, there's no reason for us to assume that this president, or any president, has this type of authority. This is embarking on a path that we should not permit. The president declared this unilaterally, and his justification is that this is his interpretation of the Constitution. He says if it's not prohibited in the Constitution, I can do anything I want. And there's a lot of people who have been taught that in our schools. I mean, this comes from the far left, but some on the right who don't understand it as well either. But that's not the way the Constitution is written. It's written, thou shalt not do anything unless you have the explicit authority to do it. Things unilaterally, the Congress has participated, assuming the same thing. And last year, just so recently, and this unfortunately, even in the House, where we have control in the House, they agree with the president sometimes on the wrong things. On some of these attacks on civil liberties and some of these wars we're fighting, we have the right, the conservatives, on the side of the president. So what did the Congress do? You know, just in December, and a bill was signed January 1st by the president. He said that posse comitatus no longer exists under the National Defense Authorization Act. He claims that the U.S. military has the proper authority to arrest any Americans that they want to. And they can do this and deny a lawyer, put in a prison secretly, and held indefinitely, and no trial whatsoever. That is not, can you imagine what the founders would think? That we did this, we passed the law and said nothing? But the one thing that I know, a lot of Americans are willing to say something when they hear about this. Matter of fact, I have been so impressed in the last 2 months by just bringing this subject up. Just say National Defense Authorization Act, and everybody knows the bad parts of the National Defense Authorization Act. So the American people have heard about this, and I can be quite certain you didn't hear it on national evening news. The attack on our civil liberties have been bad for the last 10 years. I recall very much, as every one of us did, on 9/11. It was a disastrous day for us. There's been a lot of confusion on explaining it, and some disagreement. But I'll tell you one thing, my conclusion is that we were not attacked because we were free and prosperous. There were other reasons involved on that. For several years, there had been a bill floating around that they had tried to pass. They didn't have the sentiment. There was a country that they wanted to invade, but they weren't able to galvanize the people behind it. But guess what? We started invading the countries that had nothing to do with 9/11. I voted for the authority to go after those individuals who were responsible. A person like bin Laden, guess what? It took us 10 years to find him after occupying 2 Arab countries, plus a few more, doing things that we should have been done and ignoring the things that we were supposed to be doing. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. There was no Al-Qaeda there, and there was a plan to invade and take over Iraq a long time. I remember the first speech I gave against going to war against Iraq. It was in 1998, because that is when they changed the policy. There was a resolution that it was our policy for regime change. I said, this is going to lead to war. It took a few years, but it led to war. They were looking for the right opportunity. But it was the same way domestically, attack on our civil liberties. They had a bill floating around. They did not call it what it was finally called, but there was a bill to attack on our privacy and virtual repudiation of the Fourth Amendment. So within a week or so, that bill was brought to the floor. It was called the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was passed rather easily. There weren't very many in opposition, but I'll bet you can guess how I voted. I remember it very clearly because I was annoyed with the process. I was sitting next to another member of Congress, and he was voting for it. And I said, why are you voting for this? We've only had it on the floor. Although the bill had been around, the final version had not been available to us for about an hour. And here, this major undertaking was put on the floor in less than an hour of debate. So we ended up voting. And I said, why are you voting for this? You haven't read it. He said, no, I haven't read it. I said, you know there could be some bad stuff in there. He says, yeah, I know that. I said, well, why are you voting for it? He says, under these conditions that we're suffering today, you're going to vote against the Patriot Act? And I said, he said, if I did that, he says, how would I go home to my district and explain my vote? I says, I don't know, but I think that's what your job is supposed to be. But just think, it had been called repeal the Fourth Amendment. How many people would have voted for it? So when the time comes when we have a new administration and we are going to change these problems, we shouldn't call it repeal the Patriot Act. We should call it restore the Fourth Amendment to the American people. But too often we've been rather careless with our civil liberties, but today, I tell you what, more and more people are recognizing this. I just hope it is not too late, because you have to have your liberties protected. We have to understand where our rights come from. We have to have due process, and we all have to be treated equally in the courts. And those are the goals that the founders had, and they did their very best. But you know, many of them warned us. They said, you know, we did our best on the document. It probably isn't perfect. We gave you a republic. We don't like democracy, but we'll warn you to the effect that says that if the people don't remain moral and only send moral people to Washington, the document won't save us. It'll be ignored, and I'm afraid that's where we are today. But there is a lot that we can do. We can do it because right now it's being recognized. When it's said about the Federal Reserve, it is recognized for the first time in 100 years that the Federal Reserve is part of the problem. They are not the solution. And also the foreign policy of Woodrow Wilson and almost all the presidents since, has failed. It's not part of the Constitution for us to be the occupiers and the enforcers and the policemen of the world and to change countries to get involved in civil wars. That is not part of our Constitution. Not only is it not constitutional, in many ways it's very immoral, and in many, many ways it's very impractical. One of the recent debates, this subject came up, and I made a suggestion. The immediate reaction wasn't all that favorable. I said, why don't we think about foreign policy sort of like a golden rule? The big problem was I barely got to the word rule. I said golden. They knew what I was going to say, and guess what? The reaction was not the kind of reaction we got here, because I mean, this whole idea that you can boo the golden rule is pretty amazing to me. But can you imagine what the world would be like if we would never do anything to another country that we would not have them do to us? Can you imagine how much better off we would be? That would be good. And the practical thing is we would have less enemies and we would be a lot richer. We would have a lot more wealth. In these last 10 years, we would have 8,500 Americans still alive because when you add up both wars and if you add up the contractors, 8,500 at least Americans have died. But what about the tragedies of the 44,000 Americans who have come back that have lost limbs or are blind and have brain injuries? What a tragedy. And also, there's literally hundreds of thousands of veterans today that are looking for help. They have been, just because of the trauma and the difficulty accepting post-traumatic stress syndrome, there are now many thousands, hundreds of thousands looking for help. And this is the result. Now, if this was a desperate struggle because we had been invaded and all of us are fighting for our freedoms, it'd be a little bit different. But we're going around the world looking for fights. We don't need that. The fights ever since World War II have not been very productive and wrong. Simple little thing in the Constitution which would have solved and prevented these problems. Like, don't go to war unless the Congress declares the war. That we have a strong national defense. That's not the responsibility of the states. The president is the commander-in-chief. But short of that, it falls on the Congress. You know, diplomacy and all, the Senate is involved, the money all comes out of the Congress, so there's a lot of responsibility on the Congress and on the people. But if we declare a war, as we did, just think of how World War II, less than 4 years, we were able to fight both Japan and Germany and get it over because there was a declaration of war. They knew who the enemy was. They knew what the purpose was. We fought, we won, and we came home. Then they invented a super government. You know, we all who believe that government should be local, of course, the most local important government is self-government and family government. That would be good government. Government and state government, that was intended, and the founders deferred to the states. But what about this super government that came out of World War II? A super government that I don't like. Matter of fact, I've introduced a bill every year to get out of that super government called the United Nations. Shortly after World War II, our president went to war, not with a declaration. We went into Korea under the UN banner. Our current president went into Libya under a NATO agreement and a UN resolution. And guess what? What's going on in Libya? What's going on in Egypt? After $50 billion that we gave to Egypt to bribe them to be good people, $50 billion, those systems have broken down, and guess what? Al-Qaeda is coming in. Matter of fact, there are so many people in Washington so anxious to get into Syria, and yet right now, even our own government, our own administration is saying, oh, we've got to be careful because we see that Al-Qaeda are coming into Syria. Guess where they're coming from? They're coming from Iraq. Iraq, they had no Al-Qaeda before the war. Now there's Al-Qaeda